I'm very happy to welcome here today in a virtual forum, Professor Zeynep Bulutgil. She has a new book out. It's her second book. It's a very important and timely book. It's called The Origins of Secular Institutions. And I'm also very excited that we're hosting two really important scholars who will comment on the book, Ahmed Kuru and Tomila Lankina. We're going to first listen for about 35 minutes or so by Professor Bulutgil. And she's going to present the main themes of the book, as I understand it. And then we're going to proceed with the discussion points by our two amazing discussants. And then we're going to open up for a Q&A. Okay, so without any more delays, I'm going to pass the floor to Zeynep. Zeynep, do you want to share some slides also?
Yes, I will share some slides, but before that, I wanted to thank you and the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies for hosting this event, and also thank Tomila and Ahmed for being here and taking the time to discuss the book. So with that, let me share my slides. So as Harris said, the title of the book is The Origins of Secular Institutions, Ideas, Timing, and Organization. And it just came out of Oxford University Press. Just to provide an overview, the main question that the book looks at is why do some countries adopt secular institutions while others don't? And the main arguments are about the diffusion of ideas, especially Enlightenment ideas, and the comparative organizational capacity of secular movements and their rivals. In terms of research design, the book uses both original historical data and also comparative historical analysis. So in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk about the theoretical landscape where the book sits. I'll then present the definition of institutional secularization that I use and its measurement. And then I'll move to the argument and the research design and empirical findings. So in terms of the theoretical landscape, the one that I first have in mind is the one that looks at the emergence of modern state institutions. And in this literature, there's sort of very robust debates around three topics. One is the bureaucratic capacity of states, so the extent to which they can tax and provide services. The other one is the emergence of nation states, so national ideology, and also regime type, looking at especially democratization. And the way I see this landscape is that there is a missing pillar. And that is the relationship between religious and secular organizations, and the extent to which the state separates from religious organizations. And this is where my book comes into the picture. There is also, of course, literature on religion and politics that provides some relevant arguments. And I'll just quickly talk about three of them here. The first one, and which is the one that I found comparatively convincing, is the one that is on Throne and Altar that comes from Alexis de Tocqueville's work. And the idea is that in contexts in which you have close historical relations between a monarchy and a dominant religious organization, you tend to get a secular reaction. So the reformists tend to be secular. And I have sort of two types of discomforts with this explanation. One is that when you look at contexts in which there is a close relationship between Throne and Altar, you actually see a lot of variation. So that includes quintessential cases like France, as well as cases today like Saudi Arabia. So to explain that variation, we need something additional. The other is an observation that when you look at these contexts, you actually see both secular and religious reformists. So we have to sort of think about when one side becomes dominant. The other explanation is the one that assumes rational actors and looks at competition among religious and secular politicians. And my work is different from this approach in the sense that even though it cares about competition, it really focuses on the competition between secular and religious actors and takes the ideological commitments of these actors very seriously. Lastly, there's of course this old classic literature on modernization and secularization, which typically talks about social secularization, but can have implications for institutions. And here my work is more about what types of or what dimensions of modernization play a role. Let me now talk about the concept of institutional secularization that I'm working with. And the definition relies on two necessary criteria, both of which need to be in place. The first one is the absence of religious or religiosity tests for fundamental political rights. And the second one is the existence of a legal structure, importantly, including family law, that is not based on religious rules and doctrine. Now, when you think about it this way, this is a binary concept. So a context is either secular or it's not. And here I'm sort of following John Sartori's work from years ago that argues that there is a threshold after which it doesn't make sense to have it continue. So there's a threshold after which it doesn't make sense to argue that certain countries belong on the continuum of secularization, but there could be variation among cases that are secular. And so to look at the border area between secular and non-secular, I do two things empirically. First, I adjust the measurement to make sure that my findings do not depend on a specific type of coding. And secondly, I have a chapter that's devoted to cases that belong in this gray area. And I'll talk about that a bit more later on. In terms of the sources, so I started coding institutional secularization back in 2013, and my starting point was looking at constitutions, historical constitutions, which are now digitized. That in itself was not enough because often these constitutions do not include information on family laws, which was the next step for me. So the measurement looks at a number of things that are derived from what I've talked about. First, basic political rights do not depend on belonging to or practicing a religion or sect. Second, religion is not a source of laws of the land, including marriage laws. And lastly, clergy do not play primary executive functions and do not have the power to make, amend, or reject laws. So based on that, if you look at the general picture over time, you see an increase until sort of mid-20th century, and then a sort of a stabilization after that. So let me now talk about the theory. The theory has a two-step approach because it decouples the emergence of secular movements, so movements that want to change the system, from whether or not they actually succeed and actually change the system. And this decoupling is important for two reasons. First, the first step does not guarantee the second. So there are a lot of contexts in which you have these movements emerge, they never succeed, or they take a long time to succeed. So there is both cross-sectional and over time variation. Secondly, and this is one of the core points that the book makes, is that the timing of emergence actually has implications for success, meaning that those movements that emerged earlier, for reasons that I'm going to discuss, have higher chances of success. So as a starting point, the theory starts from the observation that there are sort of two types of reformists. The first type is the religious type, and these tend to want to bring state and religious organizations closer, and they also want to get rid of alternative interpretations of religion. And historical examples for this can be Jansenists in Catholic contexts, but also Salafists, both historically and modern day. On the other side, there is the secular reformists, and they don't want to bring religious organizations and the state closer. Instead, they want to completely separate them. And if you think about it, the religious version is the more sort of path of least resistance, whereas the secular one is sort of more radical. And so one of the things that the book is trying to tease out is how the secular ones emerge and begin to organize. And here I look at two factors. The first one, as I said at the beginning, is the diffusion of ideas, especially Enlightenment ideas. And when I talk about Enlightenment, I have two sort of versions in mind coming from the literature. One is the one that everyone is familiar with, that is critical of the role of the state, a role of the church in state, and also critical of religion in terms of new scientific findings. But there is also a sort of lower version of Enlightenment that's more about material that's salacious or scurrilous, that clashes with religion in an indirect way. The second factor that sort of works with the first one is the existence of civic hubs, both formal and informal, where these ideas can be organized. And these can depend on the context. Sometimes there are scientific societies, reading societies, but sometimes they could be schools, alumni associations, as well as just informal hubs like cafes or pubs. Let's also talk about the mechanisms of diffusion and how and why it happens. And here I talk about two factors. One is the emergence of printing as a capitalist enterprise. And the second one is the extent to which there is censorship and repression. And of course, these two things are related to each other. So when you think about printing, the first thing that it does is, of course, increase the amount of material that's in circulation enormously. And that applies for both Enlightenment, secular ideas, and religious ones. At the same time, the argument I make, which comes from the existing literature, is that the share of secular material or anti-clerical material that's in circulation really increases enormously. And the reason for that is that typically the people who control censorship mechanisms are religious actors and their allies. So when they lose control, it's the type of material that they're interested in repressing that gains comparative advantage. Secondly, as I said, it's also important to look at the censorship and repression regime. So if you look at Europe in 17th, 18th century, there is repression basically everywhere, but the extent to which there is repression really varies. So there are contexts, for example, like the Dutch Republic, where there is a bit more space for ideas to circulate. So this is important because the extent to which there is censorship, of course, influences whether or not these ideas can emerge and be organized within a country. But what I find in the book eventually is also there's a neighborhood effect. That is to say, countries, even if they have a repressive regime, if they are near other countries that have different regimes, then these neighboring countries that can provide safe havens. Right. So there's both a country level and sort of a neighborhood kind of argument here. So once you sort of have the emergence of very incipient early movements, then the question becomes, as I said, when is it that they succeed? What are the conditions under which they can succeed? And there are two things that are important here. One is whether or not they can geographically spread. So go from center to provinces and regions and recruit leaders. And also the question of whether or not they can go deeper into grassroots support. And of course, whether or not they can do this while they're competing with religious political alternatives. And so with this question in mind, I start with sort of an analytical framework that's derived from some of the works, but also observations that I have from what I know about the cases. And the main argument is that the secular political movements start with a comparative disadvantage. And the reason for this is that religious ones can actually rely on a more or less ready-made organization in the form of churches, mosques, and other organizations that are affiliated with them. And this network exists more or less both in urban and rural contexts, even though it might vary from place to place. And the secular movements don't really have this type of ready-made organization in place. So either they have to identify hubs that they can put in contact with each other, or they have to actually create new associations that will help them across the territory. Secondly, Religious organizations or religious movements also have information about focal points. So where do people congregate? When do people congregate? And also they can rely on clergy as local leaders and actors. And again, these are advantages that secular movements do not have. Now, then the question is, what are the conditions under which secular political movements can overcome these disadvantages, come to government, and change the institutional structure? One answer that's very sort of easily comes from the literature on political party formation is that if you have civil society organizations, maybe from previous movements, maybe from some other sources, that can be helpful. But the main argument I make is a bit beyond this. And the idea is that the history and sequence of organizations really makes a difference. So the timing of when secular movements emerge and the timing of when religious populist movements emerge is really important. And if the seculars have more time to build institutions, both geographically and going deeper before they face serious competition, they have a better chance of success. And so beyond this, the argument I make becomes less analytical and more historical. So historical decisions and events, I argue, play an important role in this timing argument. Specifically, I argue that those secular movements that emerged before 1900, around 1900, have a better chance of success for two reasons. One is that they do not face as much of a diversification and division, and that's because the nationalist movements and also left-wing movements start picking up towards the end of 19th century. And so you don't see the division between different ethnic parties and the division between socialists and Republicans or radicals before that period. The second point I make, and this is the one that I want to underline more, is that the type of religious competition is also different in this period. If you look at the parties that were backed by religious organizations in Europe for much of 19th century, these are conservative parties. Conservative parties like the churches because these are part of the old establishment, but at the same time, they're very reluctant to go grassroots or support universal or even extended suffrage. So they're really reluctant to use the organizational capacity of these religious organizations to their limits. That kind of reluctance does not exist for religious parties that emerge later on, especially in post-colonial contexts, which take the form of Islamist parties. These parties are comfortable with being Republican and comfortable with using the organizational strength of religions to their limits. Now then the question is, why is it that you don't see this type of party in Europe before, even though there has been a challenge since the French Revolution, if you think about it. And eventually you do see Christian democratic parties. And this has been a question that I've been thinking about for some time. And if you look at what's going on in Europe, in places like France, for example, there is actually a movement much earlier to bring Catholicism closer to republicanism. This takes place in the 1830s. There are a couple of people who are clergy themselves, who are leaders, and they actually go to the Pope and ask for permission, and they're repressed. And there are two encyclicals here. One is Mirari Vos, the other one is Singulari Nos, both of them targeting both first the group and then the leader of the group, and sort of nipping this movement in its very, very beginnings. And so what that does is that for decades then, until the end of the century, secular parties that take different forms, they can be Republicans or liberals or radicals, have some time to build institutions before Christian Democrats emerge, and they can compete much more efficiently. So that's the sort of general outline of the arguments. Let me now talk about the research design. As I said, the research design has two components, the quantitative and qualitative. In the quantitative component, I'm really looking at the very, very main empirical implications. And it's a data set that includes countries with majority monotheistic populations, including those that have a mixture of monotheistic populations. In the qualitative analysis, I'm interested in more the details, the implications about when do organizations emerge, what are the implications of this, so on and so forth. And the comparative historical analysis has sort of two parts. The first one is the matched pairs, which include France and Spain and Turkey and Morocco. And these are matched both on having close throne-altar relations historically, and also sharing the same dominant religion, but then varying in terms of the outcome, timing or outcome of secularization. The other comparative historical analysis is where I said I look at the sort of gray area, and there are two cases here. One is Tunisia and the other one is United Kingdom. And when I look at Tunisia, the comparative case I have at the back of my mind is more Turkey and Morocco. And when I look at United Kingdom, it's France. So let's start with the findings from the cross-national analysis. So there, as I said, the theory has two steps, and the cross-national analysis also follows these steps to the extent that possible. So in the first instance, I look at the emergence of political parties with a secularizing platform. And there are three main independent variables. These are derived from existing works. The first one is the number of printing houses. The second one is an indicator on freedom of expression from the VDAM data set. And the last one is a sort of a very exciting project that actually provides a number of Enlightenment books in circulation, but only for Europe. So this is not a global data. And then I have a number of controls. So just to summarize, what I find is that all these three factors are positively associated with the emergence of secularizing parties while controlling for these other things. In the second step, then I start looking at the main outcome that I'm interested in, which is institutional secularization that I've talked about at the very beginning. And the main independent variables here are first, the existence of a secular party before or after 1900, the timing of secular parties compared to religious reformist parties, and also an indicator on civil society freedom. Now, when I'm looking at this, I'm only looking at contexts in which there is already a secular party that has emerged at some point in the past. So my interest is only looking at whether or not they succeed once they emerge. And once again, these three factors are positively associated with the emergence of secular institutions while controlling for some other factors that I list here. Just to give a sense of the substantive findings, I can talk in more detail in the Q&A. So if you look at a context in which a religious party precedes a secular one by some 50 years, so Pakistan would be an example here, versus a country in which it never emerges, so US would be an example of that. The difference is between 10% to 9% in terms of expectations about probability of secularization. Let me now talk about the comparative historical analysis. As I said, this starts with the comparison between France and Spain. And when you look at these cases, you see that there's a huge difference in terms of the material that was in circulation, and specifically Enlightenment type of material that was in circulation in the two contexts. And there are also many more hubs in which these types of ideas can be organized by individuals in France compared to Spain. And in Spain, they tend to be organized by the state, actually. They're not really all that independent. And France is, of course, is an early mover in terms of secularization. And then there's, of course, variation over time too, and in Spain it comes much later. But when you look at the cases, you also start seeing some other things you never see from regression analysis. So one of the things you see is that in the case of France, the censorship mechanism after a while just couldn't work. And the reason it couldn't work is that whoever was repressed could just move to Switzerland or the Dutch Republic, print whatever they wanted, and then smuggle it back. And just looking at the map, you can see why that is difficult to do in a place like Spain. So as I said, there are some attempts during the revolution in France, and then there is another organization in the 1840s called the Demosocs, who actually start reaching out to the rural areas in terms of organization. And by the time it's Third Republic, so 1870s and onwards, they're organized enough that when there's a Christian Democratic Party that emerges at the beginning of 1900s, they can actually compete and win elections. And eventually, by the time it's 1880s, they start completely secularizing family law and education as well. In the case of Spain, the first secular attempt is during the First Republic in 1870s. And then, of course, there's another attempt during the Second Republic, both of which are short-lived. Now, what you see in this case is first serious divisions regionally, but also in the second period between the socialists and Republicans, which make it very difficult for them to compete against Christian populists and also cause difficulties during the Civil War. And of course, you don't see secularization till much later, until 1980s. Now, I also want to say just a couple of words about this conceptual border that I talked about, specifically the United Kingdom. So there are a lot of similarities between France and the UK, because this UK is a context in which actually you do see a lot of Enlightenment material circulating as early as France and as widely as France. But what is different is the approach of the Anglican Church and its interaction with liberals under its own roof. And basically, they have a much softer approach. For example, at the same time that the Catholic Church leadership publishes Syllabus of Errors, which is a reinstatement of how they dislike the liberals and how liberalism is completely unacceptable. Around the same time, you see clergy among the Anglican Church publish this work that at the time was very famous called Essays and Reviews, in which they try to bring together religious doctrine and scientific advances. So they, for example, talk about on the origin of species. Right? So this approach, I think in the long run makes a difference and softens the sort of approach of both the liberals and in the long run, the left wing in the UK. And so the disestablishment of the church in England,
please try again.
In England does not take place. Excuse me for that. So let me now move to the last sort of type of comparison, which is the one between Turkey, Morocco, and Tunisia. So Turkey is, of course, among the Muslim countries, the first mover in terms of secularization. And the reason for that is partially because they were constantly sort of in war with Russia and some of the other Europeans, but really mainly Russia, which after a while pushed them to try to reform themselves. And by the time it's mid-19th century, you see sort of start seeing the product of that. There's also a very lively sort of newspaper culture during this period in the Ottoman Empire. And this is something you just don't see in places like Morocco at all. And in both cases, you do see reformists, but in the case of Morocco, they are Salafists. So they want to change the system, but they want to do it along the lines of religion. And of course, the secularization takes place in Turkey much earlier, with the family law in 1926, whereas the Mudawana, which is the family law in Morocco, is still basically relies on Sharia. Now, Tunisia is the very interesting, and in some ways it was the very exciting case for me, because when you look at Tunisia, you actually see actors who visited or who actually came from the Ottoman Empire and instituted reforms in Tunisia in the form of schools, for example. And a lot of leaders that then became important after colonization actually went to these schools during the colonial period. They also took more advantage of the French schools compared to places like Morocco. So you can see the influence of the Ottoman Empire in the emergence of the elite, the secular elite in Tunisia in the long run, despite colonization. At the same time, as I said, there is a significant difference between Turkey and Tunisia in the sense that when Habib Bourguiba, who's on the right here in the picture, defended secularization, he always tried to do it within the confines of Islam. And what you see now is that there is secular family law, but the inheritance law is still based on Islam. And also Islam is mentioned in the constitution. Now, in the case of Turkey, the move was a lot more unapologetical, and they did not try to frame it in terms of religion, right? And it goes far beyond what you see in Tunisia. And when you look at the cases, I think this is where timing and the geopolitical debates really make a difference. So on the left here, the picture on the right, but the person on the left is Salah Ben Yusuf. And he was a close ally of Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia for a long time. But after independence, they really sort of started disagreeing right before and at the beginning of independence, because Salah Ben Yusuf wanted to have a more sort of Egyptian style state ideology that would combine Islam and national ideology, whereas Bourguiba wanted more of a secular approach. And this conflict escalated to the level of civil war at the beginning, where a lot of people actually died. So the argument I make is that as a result of this, Bourguiba in a way was looking over his shoulder all the time and adjusting his policies accordingly. In the case of Turkey, there are some disagreements, but they never escalate among the leaders to the level of violence. And also, ideologically speaking, they're much closer to each other, even though there's a lot of discomfort about the type of power that Mustafa Kemal enjoys at the beginning of the republic. So that's sort of the overview of the arguments, the research design, and the cases. I'm just going to make sort of a couple of important takeaways points and then end it here. The first takeaway is that when we look at the modern state formation literature, I think one of the things that we have to maybe pay more attention to is not just whether or not there's reform, but different types of reformists with different ideological agendas, and why one type succeeds and others do not. The second sort of thing that I emphasize in the book is the role of ideas, but not just abstractly, but what are the conditions under which they disseminate? What are the conditions under which specific types of ideas get leverage? The third thing, and of course, there's already a very important literature on civil society, but taking into account both formal and informal civil society organizations and their potential role in political organization. And finally, perhaps most importantly, the role of specific historical decisions that have long-term implications. And here, one example that I've already talked about is that decision by the Catholic Church in 1830s to delay popular organization. So I'll end my talk here. I very much look forward to your comments and critiques.
Thank you, Zeynep. This is great. Let me, wrong hand. I was going for the clapping, but I can do it physically. We decided that Ahmet Kuru, Professor Kuru, will go right after you, and then we're gonna continue. Yeah.
Thank you, Haris, and other colleagues and staff members for organizing. And thank you, Zeynep, for writing such a wonderful and inspiring book and inviting me to discuss. I'm very happy to be part of this very exciting project and discussion. And if I may start with putting the importance of your book into global context, today we are seeing from Modi's BJP to Putin's right-wing populism, from evangelicals in the United States to a populist Islamist regime in making in Turkey, the importance of secular institutions are once again emphasized. And your book is bringing questions about not only its historical origins, but also conditions that make it possible. And this very timely book brings us comparative historical methods and show how comparative historical methods will bring on the table not only material conditions, but also something I personally value very much, which is the role of ideas, and which is very difficult. Analyze ideas as causal variables. That's what you are doing successfully. And I'm sure in the long run, the book will make contributions to not only sociology of religion and comparative politics, but it's truly an interdisciplinary book making contributions to multiple fields. What I am seeing conceptually that now you are defining secular institutions regarding the state building, particularly with an emphasis on citizenship as state neutrality, and also on the legal realm, especially the family law, which are crucial to define. Theoretically, it criticizes, as you also summarizes, the Tocquevillian argument of religion-state alliance, racial choice argument, and modernization theory. And instead, it provides us an alternative explanation by combining the role of ideas, institutions, and social movements, which is very difficult but very important. And methodologically, both quantitative and qualitative methods, which is impressive. And all 6 cases are crucial, and geographically and ethno-religiously give us an important spectrum. And the argument really combine what I personally find it fascinating, a historical institutional perspective with an ongoing ideological debate today, because you see that the combination of particular structural factors, the printing press and the modern schools, and agency, secularist groups, the structural factors are historical, thus created path dependency in certain critical junctures, while agency is both historical, secularist and religious groups in the 19th and 20th centuries, with some later, even older origins, and contemporary agency, secularist group today, which gives an idea about the possibility in the future. So I can go on, but I think this is the very basics I want to emphasize. And for the audience, for those who haven't read it yet, these are the reasons why they should read the book. And now my questions for further discussions. And I want to start a very practical questions, which is that I study Muslim world particularly. And on page 2, there is a fascinating figure saying us that now 60% of all countries are secular. And page 209 give us a list, but the list is not alphabetically in order. I think geographically ordering. And for example, when I try to understand how many of the 50 Muslim majority countries are secularly categorized, how many are not, it was not easy. So therefore, I'm sure you'll be invited to write some book chapters, articles where you can expand. So give us a list of all countries, the entire list, where I can see how many of the countries in the world, what is the 40%, 60%, and in my personal interest in the Muslim world, I want to see which one you categorize secular or not. That's a project in the future. A better index table will help all of us. So the questions now, first of all, the role of colonization and other international factors, does that have an impact that Morocco, Tunisia were directly colonized, Turkey indirectly, France, Spain, UK never in the modern times? Is it a factor? And also internationally, did countries have some counterproductive results to each other? For example, some in the Spain chapter, you says that some Spaniards regard France as a godless country. So they position themselves as a defender of Catholic religion vis-a-vis the secularist France. So this is an international factor beyond all the debates about secularist and religious domestic groups. But a major international factor I want to learn about colonization and colonialism, because two cases directly colonize one half. Another question is the important third category of religious reformists, because the game, if there is a game here, not between secularists and religious, or hegemonic religion, established religion, but there's a reformist. Are reformists unintentionally helping secularization? Because in some cases, like France, Protestants really helped secularization, but Salafis did not, and Salafis eventually became established. It's also a long-term question. You don't have to answer now, but it's something really keep me interested in while reading the book. One thing about the role of Ottoman ulama, especially in the printing, in my analysis, they have a very negative role, because for about 300 years, they block the printing press. Finally, Shaykhul Islam, the chief ulama, issue a fatwa around mid-18th century, allowing printing press only for non-religious books. 50 years later, they allow only for exegesis of the Quran. 50 years later, they only allow the printing of Quran in Arabic, and they never allow a translation printed. So Turks had to wait 1924, the Republic, in order to have a Turkish translation of the Quran printed. But the role of ulama as a clergy, therefore, in both Morocco and Turkey, are very negative as a resisting group on printing press. And do you see it's comparable with the Catholic clergy resistance to printing press? That's something I really want to know. And they are, and also the organization level, they are very well organized groups in both cases. And last two questions before I finish. One thing about societal secularization, because in the cases of the Muslim majority societies, Turkey, Morocco, and Tunisia, we have truly religious, pious people. You can call them conservative or religious. But in France, early secularization in society, I understand that by using Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and philosophers, you already imply that societal secularization matters. But I didn't see world value surveys or modern survey data showing these are the countries which are still highly religious. These are the countries which are secular. Maybe in the future work, you may consider its impact. Does it exist or not? The percentage of people believing in God, going to church or mosque once a week, etc. So the last question is that, and I want to read it from my notes, and there seemed to be an inherent tension between the pessimist tone in the book about the secularist movements, because they are inherently disadvantaged vis-a-vis religious movements. Their only advantage is to be early, but if they are latecomer, the religious groups have more chances. Conservative masses follow them, they have clergy, and religion is a very powerful tool of propaganda. But despite this pessimist tone, there is also general emphasis on the fact that political secularization has dominated world politics in the last 2 centuries, and it's coming. It's very powerful, and it defeated religious resistance in many cases. How do we explain that? There's many disadvantages, but still secularizing, secularists are winning on many grounds. That's a question to discuss. Thank you all for inviting me again, and these are my comments.
Thank you so much. Last commentator, a second commentator actually, will be Professor Lankin now from the UK as well, right? So we have 2 people from the US on the panel and 2 from the UK. So
Thank you very much. Congratulations, Zeynep. It's a fantastic book. I read it earlier, as you know, when it was sort of in the final stages, and I enjoyed it then, and I really enjoyed rereading it now again. So it's a really great achievement, and I'll just quickly highlight the key strengths before I sort of dive into the points that I don't want to call critiques, rather it's more about inviting all of us for a further discussion and perhaps some further thinking, and I'm sure it will stimulate further thinking and further sort of academic discussions. It's a meticulously executed study. It's got 4 main cases, but actually kind of goes across 6 cases. 6 country cases, very different geographic and historical context. And it does so masterfully with a very, very nuanced and sensitive awareness of history. It also has a rare and comparative historical analysis blend of rigorous data analysis, including really fascinating new data that Zeynep has gathered, and sort of secondary and primary kind of sort of qualitative comparative structured analysis, which is really a strength of this book. In terms of implications for not just academic scholarship, but for the lives of millions of people. So this is really something, and I'm thinking about Russia, where I come from, which is technically a secular country, but there's this increasing fusion between the church and the Russian state, and that's sort of something, it goes beyond the academic debate and into the realm of policy, because this discussion about origins of secularism has a very strong and whether countries are secular or not, implications for how people's lives are governed in the day today. And I think in terms of the theoretical contributions, there's a really fascinating discussion of the difference between and the role of the secular versus the non-secular reformist kind of forces. I think that's really fascinating. So I would suggest 5 or 6 kind of points for discussion, which I first enumerate, and then I will go into a little bit of detail into each of them. So one is the social structural aspects of conditioning of support for secularism. And here I very much would like to echo what Ahmed said, and I'll come to that in a moment. Secondly, personally, I find your kind of the separation of your argument from classic modernization explanations very convincing. But for a diehard kind of modernization scholar, I would want to see a little bit more. And again, I'll come back to that kind of defense of your argument and empirics. Thirdly, and this comes from my own work on Russia and the estates in Russia. Russia in the 19th century and all the way into the Bolshevik to the revolution in 1917 had like the estates in France. Clergy was one of the estates. But I wanted to get more of a sense of the clergy in for instance, France or in Spain, going beyond the institution and actually giving us more of a sense of the kind of societal dimension of the clergy as an estate. Now I'll explain what I mean in a moment. Role of ideas. I would like to have seen a bit more beyond beyond the Enlightenment ideas, and also, for instance, discussing the role of Marxism. Thinking opium for the masses religion. What role for Marxism was that? One would think that it was influential, especially in France. And certainly it was in Russia in terms of promoting the kind of secularist impulse. And finally, what role for women in this? And this is again relates to the point that Ahmed made about the kind of societal aspects of modernization. So in terms of social structure, we know from the comparative historical analysis and different studies about the role of different groups, the bourgeoisie, or and not necessarily in a kind of classic Marxist sense, but different social the different social groups, and whether it's because of their economic or other interests, might have different preferences for secularization. And whilst in your book you discuss across the different cases, in some countries you highlight the role of professionals like lawyers or doctors, in others the bourgeoisie, but it would be nice to kind of highlight or rather label the different groups more consistently, and perhaps kind of give us a better sense of the social structural aspects of support for secularism. Second point is about distinguishing more clearly your argument from straightforward modernization explanation. So you provide some, so if somebody were just skimming this book, right, you would come across very interesting statistics, which was very fascinating to me, that in 1930 in Spain, the literacy was 70%, which is comparable to the literacy of France in the 1880s. So this is staggering, really, how far behind Spain was. And I'm also thinking about, other sort of more peripheral countries. So really, that's just an interesting illustration of how, these kind of social aspects of demand for secularism and the broader education of the population, so how they might be important. So I agree with Ahmed here. It would have been nice to get a broader sense of the kind of wider societal modernization as in demand for secularism. So you do discuss the role of sort of the more peripheral nature in a geographic sense as well. And you showed us the map just now of, if you compare, for instance, France with Spain. But again, that could be an argument of the core versus periphery and kind of late modernization, late arrivals to modernization, which is kind of ultimately driving these processes that you are. So one could make, if one were a diehard modernization advocate, one could make that argument. My third point relates to the role, excuse me, of clergy, not just as an institution, but as a social group that is dynamic and is evolving and is in flux in the period that you're exploring. And what I say might not be relevant at all for the cases. Obviously, I'm not an expert on Europe, Western Europe, or the Muslim world. And my comment comes from my familiarity with the Russian case, and shameless plug, from this book that's also just come out, State Origins of Democracy in Russia. As I mentioned, in Russia, a state, clergy, so clergy was one of the estates. You were born into it, right? And I don't know how that was different from, for instance, France, but in the course of the 19th century, more and more we were seeing the sons of and daughters of clergymen, sons, deciding not to wear the robe, but to become professionals. Why was that the case? Why were they joining the professions in droves? So a couple of reasons. One is that they were the most literate and educated group. So in the 19th century, we observed the professionalization of the clergy, and it's transitioning to the kind of middle class in a modern sense. And they're very educated. So presumably, clergy might also have specific demands for secularism that go beyond its role as a kind of institution and part of the church, if that makes sense. So I would have liked to see perhaps, and again, this kind of takes us to this broader question about discussing broader kind of aspects of social structure and social modernization in this period where societies are very, very much in flux. Fourth comment I have, and that also kind of perhaps is echoes some of the things that Ahmed said about other groups or religious, religious sects or other dissenting groups. Perhaps there's room for a bit more conceptual fleshing out. And again, I'm thinking about Russia, how Catherine the Great invited, and you mentioned Catherine's correspondence with Voltaire, which is very interesting. She invited, these German settlers from Germanic lands, and Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church had to put up with these basically Protestants. Many of them were Protestants as well as Catholics. But for instance, Dutch Mennonite farmers became model farmers, and wherever they settled, the local economies prospered. So the rulers have to tolerate these groups because they provide economic benefits, but they also diffuse ideas and there's perhaps some indirect effect on tolerance. So I'm just suggesting that perhaps there's room for a bit more fleshing out of these kind of dissenting sects, and you have very nice discussions about the Huguenots in France, and I think certainly one would find interesting parallels in other contexts as well. I already mentioned Marx and Marxism. I may be wrong, but I would have thought that's also another. You place a very heavy emphasis, perhaps justifiably, on these earlier sort of 18th century French ideas and Enlightenment thought about tolerance and etc. But and you do mention socialist movements, but whether sort of Marxism and writings on religion, whether that starts to play an increasingly important role, those kinds of ideas in the 19th century. And finally, I would have liked to see a bit more discussion of the role of women. What was the gender makeup of some of these societies that you talked to? Presumably they were all sort of mostly male, but I know the Netherlands is not one of your cases, but the Dutch are sort of always there in the background, because one could always kind of move to the Netherlands and print kind of books there and then smuggle them back in. But Netherlands is also an example of the industrious society, where you're probably familiar with that famous book about how basically the argument is capitalism originated with the industrious, not industrial, but industrious society. And women often played a role. They ran sort of the modern equivalent of small business, and they were actually becoming more important as a kind of, including as perhaps an organized actor. I don't know, maybe they were important in guilds, or I don't know. But I would have liked to see in the statistical analysis, not just statistics on adult literacy, but breakdown female literacy would have been important. And that also relates to the point about broader societal modernization. And role of women is interesting because, as you correctly point out, in various contexts, the women often support conservative, including religiously conservative parties and forces. But at the same time, we know that educated women also have a demand for particular, perhaps more secular policies. So it would be interesting to see that perhaps in the future iteration of your work, which I very much look forward to reading. Thank you. But it's really fantastic. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you so much.
How should we proceed, Harris?
Zeynep, you have a lot of comments, so maybe you want to digest them while we collect a few more comments from the audience, because we have about half an hour. So
so maybe I get a couple of minutes at the end to respond.
Even more than a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm just saying that while you're collecting your thoughts, we can ask first from the people who have been patiently waiting, whether they have any comments or they have any, and you can just turn on your camera and ask a question if you don't mind being recorded, as I said in the beginning, or you can just unmute and talk directly if you have a question right now. Or maybe raise your hand. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Do you want to unmute first? Oh, I have to unmute you. Sorry. Let me see. It says ask to unmute. So I don't know why.
It's okay.
Harris, if you click ask to unmute, they'll be able to unmute.
Okay, now you're ready.
Muted, yes, thank you. What a fascinating talk. I should begin by saying I'm Stephen Livingston, a longtime GW professor, but not a historian, and somebody who's a bit of an interloper to this field that can create either opportunities for seeing things in new and different ways or naive questions. I'll leave that to decide what comes out here. As I was listening to you, I was thinking of Daniel Ziblatt's work, Conservative Parties and the Emergence of Democracy. And one of the things that I take away from his analysis is that the sharp line that I hear you drawing between secularism and religious parties, laws, etc., isn't quite as sharp as I hear you suggesting. So, for example, after the disastrous 2006 election for the Tories in the UK, a part of the response strategy that the Conservative Party did was to build what Ziblatt calls strong connections to a surrogate organization, the Church of England, so as to run subsequent campaigns based on cultural issues, support for the Anglican Church, so as to avoid having to deal with the fact that the Tories are most closely aligned with the wealthy, and that close alignment ended up not serving them well in that 1906 election, which led to the Liberal Party introducing all kinds of social welfare reforms and giving rise to the contemporary British welfare state, in at least the 20th century version. So the point here is that, is it really the case that a secular party is as divorced from alliances and cultural ties with strong religious groups, as at least I may have misunderstood you to say? Secondly, I'm thinking just at a philosophical level, it is sometimes said that the greatest of all 20th century liberal philosophers, John Rawls, in his theory of justice, was in fact rewriting the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount in a secular guise. So is there that much of a separation between what you call secular and religious, as we would imply? And let me just very quickly tell you what motivates this interest on my part is I founded an institute here at the university that does big data analysis. We map relationships across the globe that manifest themselves on Twitter and Facebook and that sort of thing. And so many of those relationships, so many of the maps that we create have a quasi-religious character to them. Not only are they white Christian nationalists, but QAnon, if you approach QAnon from the view of a sociologist like Emil Durkheim or Peter Berger, they would have no problem saying that QAnon, though not recognized as a religion from what I understand you to be offering, has a religious-like quality to them, as Tara Isabella Burton writes about in a book called Strange Rites. So is this world of secularism as secular as we might imagine it to be? I hope that made sense to you.
Thank you so much. We're a few buildings apart, but we're on the same campus probably, if you're on campus. So I think you have a lot of questions already. I think we can, now that you have had time to digest some of these, maybe you want to reply and then we can do another round, because our discussants may want to also make a comeback or comment on each other's.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, so I'll start with Ahmed's comments, just following the order in which I received the comments. So the first question was about the influence of colonization. So when I think about the case that I'm looking at, right, which include Tunisia and Morocco, which are both colonized by the French, and Tunisia for longer periods in some ways, so you should see more of an impact. What you see is that they have very different outcomes, and Tunisia, which experienced more colonization, actually comes out more secular. So that's maybe one argument against this idea that when you're colonized, you're less likely to get a secular outcome. But I think it's something that needs to be studied deeper. From perspective of my argument, the expectation would be that to the extent that colonial organizations allow religious associations to organize and politicize and repress secular ones, they should lead to outcomes that are less secular. To the extent that you see the opposite, it should be. So it really depends on the colonial policy, what I would expect. But I don't think there's any reason a priori to assume that colonization sort of prevents secularization. So that's how I would put it. The other question was about religious reformists and the clergy, right? So one of the things that I was surprised at the beginning when I started this project is that there are reformists among the clergy. And I talked about Jansenists. I mean, they are to be taken seriously. They're actually leading actors at the beginning of the French Revolution. And it's really very close, the competition at that time. It could have been that the Jansenists and their allies sort of win, and what you get is not the radical outcome, but something like a constitutional monarchy where the Catholic Church still. So these things historically actually come very, very close. And I try to pay as much attention as possible to reformists within the religious organizations, because it introduces this idea of, you know, history being unpredictable at the time without the benefit of hindsight. The printing at Ulama, this is very interesting, because if you look at, from what I read, the reaction of the Catholic Church to printing before Reformation, when it starts, they're actually quite excited. They expect printing to help them. And then they're of course disappointed, and then they try to censor and stop things. But of course, the Ulama and the Ottoman Empire have the benefit of watching what's going on in Europe, and they know that it's not going to serve them. Although, as you point out, eventually there are some Ulama that are open to printing. Again, there's some gradation and variation among the clergy, but they learn, I think. I mean, this is again where history plays a role. We're not looking at variables that sort of occur and sort of disappear. You're looking at actors learning from each other. So things work a little differently in different contexts. So that's, I think, very interesting. Societal secularization. It's true, I don't empirically look at societal secularization. I think one would need to sort of actually look at the data a lot closer. And one problem is that, of course, we have world values surveys and all that, but that's in the recent period. You don't really have this kind of data available for 18th century France, which I think would show that people were not secular. My sense is that in a lot of places, social secularization comes after the Second World War, that includes Europe, and institutions come before significant societal secularization. I might be wrong. I think it requires a book on its own. One thing that I look at a little bit more is questions around what people think about institutional secularization. So, for example, I have the statistic that compares Turkey and Morocco that comes from World Values Survey on whether or not they're open to Sharia as part of law. And in Turkey, the percentage of people who are open is 12%. And if you ask, do you want it to actually apply to family law and inheritance, it goes down to 10%. One wonders if those are women, actually, the 6%. In Morocco, it's much higher. I think it's in the 60s or 80s, even something like that. I can't remember, but huge difference, right? I mean, that also tells you that living under secular institutions actually changes the way people think about things to some extent. Am I pessimistic but optimistic? And is there conflict there? So I would say that, you know, if one were to tell me to predict things, I would have a pessimistic prediction. And that is because we are now looking at contexts. So the places that have not secularized are exactly the places in which religious populist parties emerged around the same time as seculars, and they're quite competitive. It is difficult for seculars to win elections and have grassroots support. They are trying though. So let me bring that question about women. Maybe this is a good sort of space to do that. If you look at Morocco, this is the only case in which I talk about women in detail, because the women's groups in Morocco, which are often sort of the women's arm of socialist parties or left-wing parties, they are very important in the small amount of reform that takes place for Mudawana, the family law. So there are some changes recently. For example, it used to be that the bride didn't even have to be present at her wedding. Now the bride actually has to be there. and has a bit of more of a say. So there are some small movements, and a lot of the push comes from these women's organizations that are attached to left-wing parties. And for a long time, the parties themselves didn't back these women. It's more recently that they start backing the women within their organization. So I think in the more recent period, you do see women playing a role. Historically speaking, these seculars would completely, I think, agree with their religious counterparts about how to treat women and what kind of rights that women should have. So I think in terms of patriarchy, early seculars are not feminists. And there are some cases of women playing an important role, especially in this country, as philosophers, but it's limited because they're just not allowed in the public space, and the men are not incentivized to allow them. But I think in the contemporary period, women do play more of a role. So I'll start talking about the question of modernization that Tomila raised, and also Ahmed also touched upon. So modernization, I don't think modernization theory is wrong. The problem I would have with modernization theory is, first, it's too broad. There are too many dimensions to modernization. So we have to think about what is it about modernization that's playing a role here. And it seems to me from the findings that it's not necessarily being wealthier. And even when those come out as significant, the results actually, in my analysis, depend on a bunch of European Protestant countries. And if you take them out of the coding, that finding is not there. Literacy, I think, is something to be taken more seriously. So I have a paper now that I'm working on that looks at the Republicans in Third Republic France, so in 1870s to 1890s or so, and looking at within France, where did they succeed more? And it's interesting because early on, the places that they succeed are not places that are wealthier at all. And literacy and prior associations, so the organization in the 1840s, are the two things that come out as important. So I think literacy is doing something there. One of the things that I'm trying to figure out in that project is, what is it doing? How is it working? My sense is that it's sort of an alternative to these associations. So associations allow parties to reach people at the grassroots, but if you don't have that, and instead you have a literate population, you can reach them by just circulating newspapers or propaganda, even calendars. They use calendars. And it's sort of an alternative path to recruiting supporters. So I think there is something about literacy there, and it is something I'm working on. But in terms of modernization, I think the question is, what aspect of modernization is doing the work? And I think that is the sort of million-dollar question, if you will. In terms of essays, it's true, I don't look at this carefully. I mean, I talk about it a little bit at the beginning of French Revolution. Of course, this is the main change, right? That the core of the initial conflict is about whether the voting should be by estate or by numbers, by sort of majority, right? So this is the only case in which I talk about essays a little bit, because it's part of the narrative. It's not clear to me how it would play a role in the theory further than that. I would need to think about it. I don't have a better answer than that at this point. In terms of the social structure, so there's obviously a very rich literature on the French Revolution that's Marxist, that really looks at the classes as actors. And what I try to do, and that is not the literature I use, the literature I use is more about ideas and organization, which is also rich and emerged as a reaction to this earlier Marxist take on the French Revolution. And the way I justify that choice, and whenever we make these choices as political scientists and we pick on some historians and not others, we need to justify that, is because I'm really interested in the type of reformists and their ideas. And by definition, Marxists, because they look at the society from the perspective of classes, those divisions of opinion and ideas within each class, and we're really looking at the elite at the beginning, are not interesting to them. So then, they're not that useful for the type of analysis that I'm interested in the cases. And maybe this is why I'm not using a class-based sort of approach in the book, even though there is a literature that does that. In terms of the role of ideas and Marxism, I think, yes, Marxism is very important, but I guess I think about it as coming after this Enlightenment literature and sort of being a result and continuation of that, even though, of course, it is not the only one. And maybe that's why. One thing that the leftist organizations do is that sometimes they play a role of undermining the seculars because they are really interested in more things like redistribution. You see that in the case of Spain, for example, in the 1930s. There are moments where the socialists and Republicans are really in conflict, and it does not serve them well in terms of standing up to the alternatives, both in elections and during the Civil War. So how the left-wing movements tend to be secular, but they can actually undermine secularism as well by introducing divisions in that coalition because they have different priorities in some ways. You also had a point about dissenting sects, right? And so dissenting sects are important, and I think it also in some ways gets to this question about whether seculars can work with religious organizations. And I think sometimes they do, as long as those religious organizations are not the dominant ones, but they're the minority, so they have an interest in secularization, which often comes with more religious freedom for minorities and syncretic sects. And so if you have that kind of setup, you can see coalition. In the case of the UK, for example, I didn't talk about this in the talk because you can only do so much, but I do talk about dissenters when I talk about the UK, and they're important both because they are divided themselves. So there are parts of dissenters, for example, the Methodists, who are for a long time not comfortable with this establishing the Anglican Church. They think this is going to, make the society sort of atheist, and they don't like the idea. There are other dissenters who really want to do that because they don't like the Anglican Church. That division itself is important because it makes things more fluid. It makes it possible for the liberals to work with some churches, but not others. It also introduces divisions within the Anglicans, which I've talked about. There are liberal Anglicans, and nobody really represses them. There are different types of liberal Anglicans as well. Some are closer to dissenters, others are closer to Catholics. They actually use the works of these Catholics in France who were repressed by the Pope. They are actually inspired by the same people, but they can, unlike their counterparts in France, implement some of those ideas, reach out to working class groups and things like that. All of these things soften the relationship between secular organizations and parties and religious organizations. So the dissenting sects in that sense, especially when there are many of them and some of them are minorities, do play an important role. And in some ways that gets to one of the questions that Professor Livingston asked as well. Let me see, what am I missing? So I wanted to very briefly talk about the scope conditions as well. This is in reaction to the last question that I received. So often sort of ideologies that inspire commitment, people call it religious. Even things like communism has been called, it's a type of religion. It is not the way I define it. And even within religions, I mean, if you look at the book, I am really focusing on monotheistic context in which historically and doctrinally there is a relationship between the church and the state. And I'm a little bit reluctant to go beyond that. I think this is a scope condition that there is a relationship to begin with. And so secularization kind of makes sense. So I can see how a movement like QAnon can be thought of as religious, but I don't think I have a lot to say about a movement like the QAnon just based on what I find in the book. And I wouldn't go that far. So I'll stop here.
Zeynep,
maybe there are other questions.
You have another question. Do you want to unmute, or should I read your question?
You can read the question. What
So
do you think?
The question is, what do you think about religious freedom in Southeast Asia, mainly in India? Is there a shift towards desecularism?
Yes, so India is not one of the cases included because it's not monotheistic, but actually it's one of those cases, I think, where there is some applicability. So first of all, India is not a context that I would define as secular, even before these changes, because the family law is not entirely secularized. But beyond that, obviously, you do see some desecularization with the BJP being in power. It seems to be that it is also a space in which there is a lot of variation from region to region and state to state. It's a huge country. So if I were to look at India, I would maybe start by looking at practices in different states or even within states, and try to figure out the extent to which there is desecularization within each state. It's a really complicated and big country, so I'm a bit reluctant to make sort of sweeping generalizations. But if BJP is in place, BJP is a religious party, and the precursors to BJP are quite old. They even exist in this sort of colonial period, and their functions are, I think, comparable to other parties and associations that support them in the Islamic world or in some Christian contexts.
Great. So I had a question, given that the role of organizations is key here, right? Either as movements or civic associations, and but it's also key for ideologies like nationalism, and it's also key for ideologies like communism, as you said. And so my question is, how do you see these forces competing with each other for similar organizational vessels that they're trying to capture? Is there a competition, you think? Are they seen as substitutes in some cases, but not in others? When are we more likely to get fusions that are maybe even contradictory fusions, like the one we were talking about just before the panel, or not, right? So I'm thinking now of, I was recently writing a book review for Sinisa Malesevic's book on grounded nationalisms. And one of the important prerequisites for the grounding of nationalism is organizational structures, either the state or others. So, and Michael Mann, of course, has written a lot about that. And so I'm wondering, are we talking about parallel organizations or organizational structures? Is similar civic associations could be used as vessels for multiple projects? When are they more likely to be competing and when not? Is there a kind of like a typology or an insight you developed while you were working on this particular topic that you want to share with us? I'm not expecting you to answer all these questions, but to maybe give us some insights from what you found.
I think this is where timing plays a role. So earlier secular movements are also nationalist, and nationalist in the territorial sense. As you go sort of after the beginning of 20th century, you start seeing more ethnic versions of nationalism. And in those versions, then they can divide secular. So for example, in a place like Austro-Hungarian Empire, you start seeing Czech liberals and German liberals, right? They could be just liberals and they tend to be more secular, but that is not the case, right? So once you have this ethnic version of nationalism, they become more sort of competitors with each other. Before this, though, the Republicans or radical liberals also tend to be more on the nationalist side. This is partially why they're not also too fond of the Catholic Church, because they think of the Catholic Church as having sort of affiliations outside of the territory of the state, which is not something that's very desirable for a nationalist. So this would be my starting point to study the relationship between nationalism and sort of secularism. But that's just the starting point. I think we'll
because I think that
yeah.
would also give us some insights on the big debate about political Islam and whether it's compatible with different versions of nationalism or regime types, or even pan-Arabist movements versus national movements versus religion kind of interacting with all this, or cross-cutting or not. And I'm feeling like that there is something there, it seems, from your argument that could speak to those things.
Yes, so when I talk about, for example, religious reformist or religious populist parties, I include Islamist parties, but I also include parties like Istiklal, which was in Morocco, or the FLN in Algeria, where really the idea is a version of nationalism that's based on Islam. Right. So I don't distinguish between those. Historically speaking, I think the ones that are nationalist and Islamist come earlier than the populist, just Islamist parties. I don't have an answer as to why that is the case, but I think it might be interesting to look into that. I want to say one thing about compatibility between Islam and nationalism. I think Islam and nationalism are compatible, and I think there are cases of that. But there's another question about Islam and democracy, right? This is where a lot of debate is also taking place. And one question is, do you get moderation through participation? Right? So if you have Islamist parties competing in a democratic system, even if they start radical, do they moderate over time? And this is an important question. And one answer that I'm giving is depends on what they're participating in, right? If they have significant competition, that is good for moderation, because then they have to moderate. This is what happened basically with Christian democratic parties. If you look at, for example, Statistical work on Christian democratic parties, the first paragraph calls them secular. When they started, they were not necessarily secular per se. They wanted to defend the positions of the church. But they became secular over time because they were operating in a context in which you had strong secular parties, right? And if you don't have this, religious parties don't have an incentive to moderate, right? So this is, maybe you open the door for me to say something about democracy and Islam. And I think this is how we should think about it. It's not so much about nationalism, but it's about democracy.
Great. No, these are exactly kind of the thoughts that I expected you would also share with us. You've been listening to these responses quite patiently, Ahmed or Tomila?
No, I think it's a fascinating discussion, and Zeynep
We're at time, so you don't have to. Yeah,
Zeynep answered very well. Yeah, I don't have a very specific point to add.
Mm-hmm. This was a wonderful discussion, but Tomila, do you want to add something?
I just wanted to say I've really enjoyed the discussion and also learned a lot from the Q&A as well, and from Ahmed's comments and from Zeynep clarifying some of the kind of the points or questions. I should say I've also got my comments are typed up, and I'm happy to send them to you, Zeynep, in case anything was unclear. And because we're both based in London, I'm sure we'll be having many coffees going forward. And
thank you. This is super useful because, for me, this is not just the book, but it's an ongoing sort of research area. So any comments you have, I can think about incorporating those in future work. So I'm really, really thankful. Thank you very much.
This was great. This is what this is supposed to be. It's both a book launch to praise a book and congratulate the author, and but also food for thought for the audience and for the author for future projects, right? So thank you so much, Zeynep, for giving us such an important book. Go and buy it online or at the bookstore near you. And I hope we're gonna be here presenting whatever comes out of this conversation in a couple of years.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.